The development of science. Science is only around 400 years old. Its application to the social sciences is even younger. Getting this grounding is the first step in beginning to understand the richness, the wealth, and depth of qualitative methodology. If we go back as far as written records will support, we'll see that the empiricist foundation, the beginnings of empiricism or the empirical tradition began in the 4th century, before the Common Era. Aristotle started it with his work, and soon after that, Titus Lucretius Carus added to it a couple hundred years later in The Nature of Things. Whereas Aristotle was, fighting with Socrates and Plato, you could say about, the bigger things of how it is that we know, which is what empiricism is all about. Titus Lucretius Carus made a very clear, solid argument that, empiricism is better than any other way of doing things. I'm jumping quite amount of time past the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment era of Europe to illustrate the resurrection of the empirical tradition. It was at this point in the 1400s where, second-born sons were sailing the high seas and trying to make a name for themselves by leaving their homes in Europe and trying to find new exotic homes, or just make a name for themselves being ship captains and sailing back and forth, merchant ships, trading in the Orient or in the far West, the West Indies. But it was at that point that these guys needed tools, right? And it wasn't so. And my point here is science and love of science was not driving this cause, but rather, the love of adventure or greed or expansionism, whatever you want to call it. But it was at this era that we saw a huge increase in the use of empirical tools, the compass and the sextant specifically, and technologies. If you think of systematic observation as an important technology, writing notes every night, looking up at the stars in your ship, if you're trying to navigate across the ocean, every night looking for the stars, seeing where they are, plotting your points against your compass to see, am I off course, am I on course? Of course, the plus and minus back then must have been far, far wider than it is today in terms of navigation. But it was not only the technology, but the fact that captains of ships were beginning to read and write and needing to read and write and finding the value and importance of needing to read and write as being an essential tool for the trade, as it were. So this increased literacy, and increased scientific sort of thinking, and by scientific I mean, repeated measures, doing the same thing day after day, recording it, making sense of those notes. That was the huge, a big thing for the growth of science in the Enlightenment. If you'd think 100 years before that, let's say in the 1200s, and that a king's only need was to be able to, speak well in front of groups, maybe, to sword fight and to dance. He was probably illiterate. Most kings back then, they had scribes to do that sort of stuff. So, this moves into, the same era, this quote unquote pressing need for more publications, more documents. If more people are reading, then there's going to be more things needed to read. And Gutenberg comes along, at the perfect time with movable type. That, of course, really helped the Protestant Reformation. But the Protestant Reformation is more just an example, a side effect, an epiphenomena of the thing that I'm trying to talk about, which is this growth of scientific literacy. Right? The big step on the science end, now that the world is seemingly prepared for scientists to, achieve their global status that we all know they have achieved, comes with Johannes Kepler. Other people could say others. In fact, my favorite is Galileo. But now that I'm on the school board of Kepler in Fresno, and my children go there, I thought, let's add Kepler into the mix. Anyway, and in truth, this is the term what they often say about when they use the term zeitgeist. A paradigm shift is another one that Kuhn uses. The spirit of the times. The zeitgeist is of such a nature that systematic empiricism could have naturally erupted. If it were not by these guys, it could have been some people, off in Africa somewhere or somewhere else. But the spirit of the time seemed ripe for this level of science to arrive at the scene. Anyway, in Kepler's case, in 1571 was his birth. Back in that era, astronomy and astrology were the same thing. If you think about, and beyond that, there's a strong distinction between astronomy and physics, which we don't see that as much right now, but back in that era, the queen of the sciences was philosophy. Well, it was actually theology. And philosophy was beneath theology. Again, this is all very, Christian Catholic oriented, this whole era. So in that sense, the astronomy coming from math had nothing to do with natural philosophy. And natural philosophy, again, started out of a logical tradition, but natural philosophers were also the first biologists, the first people who went out and actually collected real data, generated real data. Why does a dog bark? Where do flies come from? Even the ancient Greeks asked stuff like that. They thought that flies came from the carcasses of dead animals. Well, and they're doing that through empirical observation. They watch a cow, all of a sudden some flies come out of the cow. They didn't realize there was an original fly that got there that, laid its maggot eggs and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, natural philosophy was this thing that was all about natural observations. It begot physics because they're naturally observing the astral bodies, stars. But connecting that to astronomy, this whole idea was a big deal, or was a big accomplishment for Kepler, bringing the two, astronomy and physics, together. And to a world who, didn't think of these things as the same at all. Also, I remind you, the people who turned gold or lead to gold, what were they called? The Philosopher's Stone and all that. They're not druids, but it's basically magic, in this era, magic and science were extremely difficult to distinguish between. And in this era, Galileo comes along and develops his own thing. So Galileo's coming along around the same time. 1564 is his birth. I'm going to back up a second. 1571, was Kepler. Oh wow, and it's the same picture. Galileo and Kepler are the identical person. Oh. Anyway, this is actually a picture of Galileo. Sorry about the typo. But Galileo comes along. He refutes the Ptolemaic geocentric theory of the heavens. Ptolemy, well, that's ancient Greece. So that's an old classic that was thought up cleverly, but incorrectly, that the Earth was the center, and the stars and the planets, particularly, and our sun, all revolved around us, right? Galileo said it was wrong, proved it was wrong with math. He said, no, I've done the numbers, and it doesn't make sense that way. And he got in trouble with the Pope because he didn't like the Pope, and he said the Pope was kind of silly and wrong, and all that. So he didn't argue too well. But anyway, the truth came out, and the truth was born out of science in terms of his point. But for us, again, what was going on here that is of interest to our interests in qualitative methods and scientific thinking in any sense is this notion of the experiment. Okay. What is an experiment? Has there been an experiment before? Are there laboratories? Are there laboratory requirements for being in the lab, arriving in the lab, putting on the white coat, following the certain techniques, what some will call methods, which I'm afraid of because of methodology that I'll explain later about epistemology. But in essence, the experiment is born with Mr. Galileo. What Galileo did was extremely rigid in his empirical tradition, which makes sense. If you're the first person to do something, you're often going to do it, you're going to stick to the rules as precisely as possible. Imagine baking a cake for the first time. You're going to follow the directions to the letter. After you've baked 1,000 cakes, I'm sure you know where you can bend the rules without harming the cake and everything, and where you can't. And that is, in essence, the practice of science or empirical methodology. It started with Galileo, but he was really rigid. He would anything he occurred to him in his head, he had to test out. If he didn't test it, he didn't believe it. So he was extremely rigid. He was the guy, who brought the cannonballs up on the Tower of Pisa and tipped it over, and that sort of thing. That's all Galileo. He's kind of like Popeye in that sense. I think of him as just being really, really, a person who demands, explicit sort of rules. Now, in the same era, soon a little after, 1596 now, and in the same era, 1561, we see the rise of rationalism. Okay? Now, rationalism is not at all like empiricism. In fact, in one way or another, you could think of it as the opposite. René Descartes, he was the one who said, je pense que suis-je, right? I think, therefore I am. What is it? Comito sum ergo, or cogito sum ergo, right? I think, therefore I am. And for Descartes and Bacon in the same spirit is trying to apply rationalism to systematic induction sort of thing, systematically observing things, and but from this inductive approach. Now, all these other guys I've been talking about up to now, I would throw in the more of a category of more deductivist. Rationalism is this notion that if you think of it, it's real, right? Empiricism has been coming along all the way up till now with Galileo, is saying, no, I have to see it to believe it. If I don't see it, I don't believe it. Descartes, if I think it, it's real. Okay, and that's a beautiful sort of a duet, right? These two people are coming along and they're really perfecting their two different traditions of rationalism and empiricism, and they're bumping up into the heads right in the middle of the 16th century. And the denouement, or whatever, the crescendo of all of this dance, I would say, is Isaac Newton. He comes along and is radical. He's radical in his thinking. He's radical in how he observes the world and perceives the world. he basically, is credited for starting the scientific revolution at Cambridge because he invented the calculus. Now, there was someone, and this is that other thing I said about coeval before, that the time was ripe for this sort of thinking. Gottlieb, I forget his first name, but another guy in Germany, invented calculus at the same time. But most historians will say, no, no, no. Newton gets all the credit for inventing it first. Um, but and and of course that's all great and interesting. Cambridge loves them still and all that. And calculus, I'm sure it's fine. I have no idea how to do it, but anyway, what again is important for us is the progression of science and how the empirical tradition got to where we are. Right? We are practicing social science here, and in qualitative methodology, it's social science, but it is science. Okay, and so for us, again, the second bullet point is the essential part here, the hypothetico-deductive model. Newton invented the hypothetico-deductive model. Now, I remind you, before we had Galileo, who invented the experiment, and with explicit, rigidity to the empiricist tradition. Newton put some finery on it, you could say. What Newton did was say, okay, I'm going to combine the empirical observations, the rigid experimental, rigor of Galileo, with the clever, reasonable thinking of Descartes, Cartesian reason. That's Descartes. Combining the two of them, I end up with the hypothetico-deductive model. And that's what its name is. So at this point, you don't have to test anything you think up. You can think up an entire experiment in your head, and logically piece through a lot of the steps leading up to the big, question, the big ask. But then once you have these questions, then you must go out and do, rigid empirical observations, experimentations. So that's kind of the key thing for, like I said, comparing it to the earlier, cruder form of Galileo. Galileo didn't allow himself to think stuff up. He would always just observe, maybe a bird flying, and then he'd experiment with that or something like that. Whereas Descartes, our current fellow, Newton, he again says, it doesn't matter where you get the ideas from. It's fine to get your ideas from anywhere. Just build them into an experiment and test it. That's the wild thing, that this was early, late in the 1600s. All this stuff was cooked up, and that is the methodology that we are using today, that you're going to use finishing your dissertations, and and all of that. So all started here. Which is why, if you ever want to fight who was better, Einstein or Newton, I always say Newton, because Newton, not only did he build the calculus, but he built all the tools to actually use it. But that was a brief aside. Now, our shift from the heavenly bodies, stars and all that Galileo and Newton focused most of their energy on to take our empiricist tradition and bring it forward. We're now trying to shift it to the humans. And of course, humans is what this course is about. Qualitative methodology, and I, as a qualitative methodologist and anthropologist, am all about humans. And one thing about humans is we are insatiably interested in ourselves. So now that Newton has invented the scientific method, basically, the hypothetico-deductive model, friends of his, John Locke, at the same time as Newton, they lived, and all that, they were friends, automatically almost, Locke is applying these rules that are affecting the movements of astral bodies, of planets. Locke wants to apply that, or at least he didn't do the work, but he said, I wonder if that could be applied to humans, right? Because, of course, humans really are interested in humans more than they are in stars and science and anything else. So Now we invent this new thing called the scientific method. Huh, could scientific method apply to humans? Um, and he just reasoned it. It was more of a thought of his. It took another 100 years until Auguste Comte, a French mathematician, was to invent the word sociology. And Comte's sociological analysis is horribly rudimentary. And most of it is wrong, and it's fun to critique maybe his analysis. And you can imagine a person who taking Newton, and Comte was a mathematician. I mean, so it was all extremely mathematical. Now we understood how gravitation works. And this is something that none of these guys talked about, but I'm beginning to use in my own, sociological analysis of things, using the phrase social gravitation. And I don't simply mean someone who's very popular draws other people to them, but when you think about how groups of people work, if you look at a classroom of students, and I spent years, observing every day with a video camera, sixth grade math class. I did that for my dissertation. It's fun to slow down the video camera and watch all the heads, rise up and all the heads go down. And it reminds you, so it sometimes looks like a flower opening, a natural thing. It's similar to a flock of birds. If you're riding your bike and you see a flock of birds in the sky, it kind of looks like, a drop of water, right? So there are these elements to social function in groups of humans that give you a feeling that there are, invisible hands at work motivating them, as it were. And of course, that is the nature of what social science is trying to figure out, right? How is it that all of these kids, know right when the class is about to end and stuff like that? It's always a fun question if you are ever in a class teaching. When does the class end? Is it when the bell rings, or is it not? In my college classes, my undergraduate classes, frequently it comes that the students are ending class, not me, and that they pretty much start putting their bags away and that sort of thing. And usually, and this is the interesting point about these social forces or gravitation, it's typically not one student putting his bag away, and because I'm extremely interested in these things. I haven't videotaped myself teaching to see this whole idea of when the class ends. Be an interesting research study. But here's the point. For your own investigation, what I've seen over and over is a seemingly coincidence. On two different sides of the room, two people seem to start putting their bags away at the same time, or put their backpack on the desk. Some sort of thing that begins a crescendo, of other people just beginning to put their bags away, and the class is beginning to end at that point. Some professors might use their personal authority and say, class is not over, But in a sociological sense, class is over. It's just class has ended, and the students define the ending through their actions, and the teacher is resisting that fact and trying to hold them another minute or two. That's how I would look at it sociologically, and that again is similar to what Comte was originally trying to do, taking the gravitational forces, the invisible forces that were controlling the planets. This is how Newton was explaining it to the people at the time, and applying that to humans, in that sense. Again, this is 1789 when he's born. He got these publications out, early 1800s. It was, again, over and over and over, all wrong, but sociology began then, and it didn't take much longer, century at most, about a century, until, maybe a century plus, 150 years for sure, till, Durkheim and Weber and Marx are really building what sociology is to this day, the real foundation work of it from those guys. And then we're here, now we're in the social sciences, and now you're up to date. And so for the rest of the course, as we further, plumb notions of things that are socially logical, sociology, right? or an anthropology, sociology. For all intents and purposes in this class, it's the same thing. Much of education is a social science. Most would agree. We see that the roots of where we've gone, and that's basically the point of this mini lecture on the foundations of science. Thank you. Back up a moment to remind you of the date. Oh, sugar. I've messed up again. Oh, man. I'm going to have to do some post-production shifting around with this. Damn! Okay, here we go.